Welcome to An Audience with Angela Davis. This is the first event in the Southbank Centre Inside Out series. The Southbank Centre has now been closed for 6 months and is delighted to reopen with this virtual audience with Angela Davis. This event is also supported by the Stuart Hall Foundation. And as we've just seen, the Stuart Hall Foundation's reconstruction work, online conversations, and wider public programme aims to bring together an array of intergenerational artists, writers, and activists aiming towards building a better society. And in the pursuit of this aim, it's fitting that Angela Davis is here tonight as a key figure to enter this conversation and this reconstruction work. My name is Brett St. Louis. I'm a sociologist from Goldsmiths, University of London, and I'll be the chair for this event. It is my pleasure to introduce Angela Davis, activist, writer, and academic, distinguished Professor Emerita from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Angela Davis has worked within numerous freedom struggles for over 50 years since the 1960s. She can be described in numerous ways: leftist, socialist, feminist, anti-racist, and we must remember that she is all of these things and more at the same time. Her interventionist scholarship has engaged the US context as well as wider global struggles, including South Africa and Palestine. Another significant aspect of Angela Davis's activist and academic work is her combination of incisive critique and positive intervention. Her work on the prison industrial complex, for example, combines a powerful case for the abolition of prisons while asserting the necessity of properly funding improvements in public services and opportunities: education, employment, housing, healthcare. Angela Davis's contribution is also notable in its acknowledgement of the past and ongoing effects of history, while also looking forward to the future. This is exemplified by her interest in and encouragement of new, younger generations of activists. Our format for this event is that Angela will provide a keynote address which will last for around 30 minutes. We will then open up a discussion, and I will raise some questions submitted in advance by audience members. Angela Davis is in California. I'm at the Southbank Centre in London, and you, the audience, are dispersed across the UK. These are indeed difficult and challenging times, and we're only able to be together virtually. But at the same time, perhaps we can think about this also as an opportunity. The fact that we are together virtually means that this event is accessible to more than it would ordinarily have been. So even in these challenging times, it's important for us to think about some of the opportunities that we can make. And now, with no further delay, I'd like to hand over to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Angela Davis.
Good evening. Actually, it's morning where I am, but I think it must be evening in the UK now. Let me thank the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Southbank Centre for this opportunity to speak to you across many miles and oceans. Since I've already spoken a couple of times, I believe, in the Royal Festival Hall at the Southbank Centre, I'm now imagining that beautiful venue and the many people I have seen there in the past. These days, of course, we've had to rely much more than usual on the power of our imaginations. And I've just learned that Brett St. Louis is actually in the hall, and I asked him prior to this whether or not it was a virtual backdrop, and he assured me that he is actually in the Royal Festival Hall of the Southbank Centre. But let me say that it is hard to believe that it has already been 6.5 years since Stuart left us. I would like to thank Catherine Hall, Becky, and Jess, as well as all of the phenomenal individuals who have helped to make the Stuart Hall Foundation an important site for public reflection on many of the issues that were of concern to Stuart. It has been especially important during this long period when we are sheltering in place. I hesitate to use the word lockdown because of the linkage of this concept to prison protocol, and because the situation of those of us who live in the free world cannot really compare to actual lockdown processes inside prisons. I have appreciated the opportunity to hear Lola Olufemi and Gary Young and others whom the Stuart Hall Foundation has presented during this period. And of course, I am myself deeply grateful for the opportunity to participate in this event. In the very last conversation I had with Stuart Hall, about a month before he died, he emphatically talked about speaking truth to power, but not abstractly, not for self-gratification, but rather in contexts that might eventually diminish injustices in our worlds. Such contexts require us to at least attempt to examine what Stuart called the present conjuncture. And so I've been asked to share some ideas regarding the current predicament in the United States. But actually, before I do, I want you to know that one of the great pleasures I have experienced during this period of shelter in place, which has required us to make more abundant use of online video communications, has been watching the newly discovered video of Stuart's address to the 2004 Caribbean Reasonings Conference, which was convened in his honor. His lecture, entitled "Through the Prism of an Intellectual Life," is an extraordinary exercise in self-reflexivity, which allows us not only to understand Stuart Hall's own intellectual contributions, but precisely also to apprehend how central intellectual practices are to possibilities of radical transformation. I can tell you that the video is available on YouTube. It is absolutely brilliant. It is edifying. It is inspiring. It is provocative. And I dare say it will help you to understand just how complicated and expansive the process of understanding the present conjuncture must be. We find ourselves experiencing a moment which is quite extraordinary. One which many of us never expected to see in our lifetimes. And precisely because we are experiencing a new conjuncture, many of us have been mourning Stuart's death anew, because he, more than anyone else, would have been able to bring a measure of clarity to this moment. But even if he is not here to do the hard work of understanding what he called the contradictory, stony ground of the present conjuncture, we cannot turn away from the task of trying to make sense of where we are and how this moment has been produced by and within history, and how we might actively contribute to ameliorating the circumstances in which those people live who have been exploited, oppressed, and confined as a consequence of the juggernaut of racial capitalism. I mentioned Stuart's mandate to speak truth to power. In the 2004 lecture I mentioned, which took place at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, he said, "I do think it is a requirement of intellectuals to speak a kind of truth, the best truth they can know or can discover, to speak that truth to power, to take responsibility, which can be unpleasant and is no recipe for success for having spoken it, to take responsibility for speaking it to wider groups of people than are simply involved in the professional life of ideas, to speak it beyond the confines of the academy, to speak it, however, in its full complexity, never to speak it," he emphasized, "in too simple a way, because," quote, "the folks won't understand. Because then they will understand and they will get it wrong, which is much worse. So speak it in its full complexity, but to try to speak it in terms in which other people who, after all, can think and do have ideas in their heads, though they are not paid or paid up intellectuals. They need it like you and I need food. They need it in order to survive. Here in the United States, a group of scholars, advocates, activists, and cultural workers have been insisting for a very long time that the reform of institutions that are intrinsically repressive and are steeped in histories of racism and class division, such as prisons and police, will never accomplish more than the continued reproduction and the rendering more permanent of structural racism and class exploitation under the guise of so-called democratic reform. The most dramatic calls for prison abolition emerged during the Attica Rebellion in 1971 and the development during that period of radical prisoners' movements. With this, I'm trying to underscore the point that it was prisoners like George Jackson, Sam Melville, Erica Huggins, Frank Big Black Smith, who first introduced the concept of prison abolition in the 20th century. And I'm saying this because I do not think we should underestimate the intellectual contributions of people in prison. For the last 50 years, many of us have organized, written, spoken, made art in terms designed to popularize the notion of abolition. And especially since the late 1990s, since the critical resistance conference that happened in September 1998, we've been arguing that dismantling carceral and policing institutions will be a central aspect of the process of bringing down structural and systematic racism, and that ultimately eliminating racism will entail abolishing its structural incarnations. In fact, those who claimed that the election of Obama to the presidency had ushered in a new post-racial era. We responded by pointing out that the elimination of racism would never be accomplished simply by the rise of Black and brown individuals to positions of power. Neither would it occur simply as a function of diversity and inclusion strategies. Rather, it would require acknowledging and bringing down the structural and systemic embeddedness of racism in all our institutions. So when we attempted to understand the rise of what we decided to call, borrowing from Mike Davis's term, the prison industrial complex, we recognized that it was certainly a product of global capitalism, but in complex ways, and serving as a dramatic example of the way racial capitalism can rely on historical operations of racism while generating at the same time new forms of structural racism. The call for abolition was designed to point the way toward more substantial popular critiques of racism within feminist intersectional frameworks that centered the impact of racial capitalism. I raise this because I believe that this is the piece that tends to disappear as abolition becomes an acceptable strategy to address racist police violence. And I'm referring to the part played by capitalism and class, necessary class analyses. We are now in the 7th month, I believe, of the COVID-19 pandemic. It could have never been predicted that the shelter-in-place provisions designed to slow the course of the pandemic would create the conditions for what the established media have been calling a collective reckoning with racism. Before we found out about the vigilante killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and the police murders of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the public was made aware that the damage wrought by this novel coronavirus disproportionately affected Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. And that the enormity of this damage was produced both by the fact that people of color are essential workers, that is to say, the health workers, the sanitation workers, the food workers, they are the ones who are compelled to work when everyone else is under a stay-at-home order. And also produced by the racial discrimination that is built into the existing privatized healthcare system that operates under the dictates of global capital. When we saw the videos of the Ahmaud Arbery killing in Georgia, and then the video of the last minutes of George Floyd's life as he uttered Eric Garner's words, "I can't breathe," as the knee of a white police officer pressed unrelentingly on his neck, we were transformed into the unwilling audience of a lynching, which, of course, in the early 20th century had taken on the character of crowds witnessing state-sanctioned executions, jubilant crowds, as a matter of fact, as if to challenge the very easy assumption that Black lives, that the Black lives that are extinguished by state violence are exclusively male. We learned about the police murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, And we learned about the murder of Tony McDade, a Black trans man. Even those of us who are not aware of these histories of lynching and their historical connections must have felt the surge of these histories and recognized, at least at some level, that now was the time for interruptions. Who could have ever imagined that the largest anti-racist demonstrations in the history of this country would occur under these conditions? And especially because we knew that leaving home and gathering in large crowds was at our peril. Not only did people pour out into the streets all over this country, but people rose up all over the world, and not simply in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, but in response to the awareness that racism is a global phenomenon, that colonialism, slavery, and capitalism, racial capitalism, to use Cedric Robinson's term, have created the trajectory that has led us to this point. And of course, as you all know, the connection between racism and state violence is not simply a US problem. The reverberations of the police killing of Stephen Lawrence are still being felt as people in the UK engage in resistance. We remember that Black queer activist Marielle Franco was assassinated by a former police officer in Brazil because she had challenged the militarization of the police and the fact that police violence in Brazil claims more Black lives than anywhere else in the world. Adama Traoré was murdered by a police officer in the suburbs of Paris, and his phenomenal sister Assa has been leading a movement against racist state violence in France over the last years. People in Iran are still standing up to the government as they attempt to memorialize the activists who died in the 1988 prison massacre. People in South Africa are grappling with the post-apartheid structural racism that is still embedded in their police departments, even though virtually all of the police officers are now Black. And resistors in Palestine, who have played a major role over the last period in encouraging us to recognize the ways that the US depends on repressive strategies developed by Israel to defend its occupation of Palestine. They reminded us that US police departments, including the one in Minneapolis where George Floyd was killed, have been trained by the state of Israel. The toppling of the 17th century, the toppling of the statue of the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol, a continuation of the Rhodes Must Fall movement that began in South Africa, I think we need to remember, reflected the collective re-evaluation of the place of power and privilege occupied by representations of white supremacist military and political leaders, especially, but not only here in the US, in the southern states. It is remarkable how the slogan, Black Lives Matter, moved quickly from the sidelines of established political discourse to the center. We recall that during the last election campaign, which was only 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton had offered the slogan, "All Lives Matter," as what she said was a more inclusive version of the Black Lives Matter slogan. But But what she was doing was accentuating the tyranny of the universal in the process of being subsumed under the putatively universal category, all lives, where Black lives are expected to disappear and to become relatively unimportant because they constitute a numerical minority in the population. Black lives were expected to genuflect to all lives, in other words, to white lives. However, now that there is a popular recognition of the logic embedded in the slogan Black Lives Matter, which precisely in its particularity calls for a more robust version of all lives. Precisely in order for all lives to matter, Black lives must be made to matter. We have moved, it seems, toward a new popular understanding of the dialectical relationship between the particular and the universal. I mentioned that abolitionist theoretical frameworks began to shape popular demands in relation to institutions of state violence, defund the police, of course. But the first demand to incorporate abolition was the demand to decarcerate the jails and prisons in response to the COVID pandemic. And as Critical Resistance pointed out, abolitionist measures, while often brushed off as drastic by mainstream voices, are now being lifted up as the most effective and practical steps to protect the health of people under the control of the prison industrial complex during the spread of COVID-19. The only solution is decarceration. And I should say, it's interesting that prisoners are the ones who've been on the front lines of fighting the wildfires in California. And just now, we are seeing a legislative bill that allows former prisoners trained as firefighters within prison will have the opportunity to apply for jobs with the fire department when they're released. But let me say that abolition keeps our vision on the future. If people can be released today from jails and prisons under the pressure of this health crisis, why can we not call for an end to jails in Indian country? In fact, all jails, all immigrant detention facilities, all prisons. But let me pull back for a moment and make the point that virtually every relevant radical social critique calling for transformative change has been confronted with efforts to pare it down, to blunt the radical edge so that it can be represented as palatable to those who are either afraid of radical change or are so completely dependent materially or ideologically on the existing order that they cling to familiar structures and ideas. So that which demands change is confronted with strategies that appear to enable change, but in actuality, genuflect before the existing order. This has been the path of too many movements initiated by people who are genuinely motivated to change the world. Prison reformists have always wanted to transform conditions and to make life better for those who are sent to prison. But over the decades and centuries, their reform work has been assimilated into a process that has rendered the prison one of the most immutable and enduring institutions in human societies. Beth Ritchie has written about the extent to which largely white mainstream feminist movements that believed that they could rid the world of domestic violence ended up embracing existing forms of criminalization that reinforce the institutional structures that perpetrate and perpetuate circuits of violence. Her idea of winning the mainstream but losing the movement can be used to understand how it is that what begins as a radical transformative impulse ends up affirming the very forces responsible for this violence and oppression. Mimi Kim has insightfully examined the trajectory of what she calls the carceral creep. How easy it is to reach for existing strategies and tools, assuming that they alone can bring about change. If prisons are overly repressive, just carve out that which renders them racist and repressive, but leave everything else intact. But soon, of course, the perceptive among us recognize that racism and repression are not discrete problems that can be removed by dissection, but rather are integrally woven into the very fabric of carcerality. Once one assents to criminalization as a strategy to reduce gender violence, one is precisely affirming the social and political processes involved in the production and reproduction of both personal and institutional violence. This is how assimilation happens. This is how we end up unintentionally doing the work of the state, the work of global capitalism, the work of neoliberalism without even realizing it. Police and prisons are intimately connected. No transformation of one of the fields can work without also transforming the other field. We cannot defund the police and develop new approaches to health and safety that are not dependent on armed humans and the violence they threaten, without at the same time taking seriously the importance of prison abolition. In both instances, abolition is not primarily about the negative act of elimination and revocation, but rather it is about the process of recreation, about building something new. We do not get rid of the old and assume that the new must be constructed on the same foundation as the old. We create new foundations, new footprints, new societies. Our focus today cannot be so narrowly directed toward what we oppose, but rather we should direct it on what we want. Instead of police and prisons, we want housing, education, jobs, art, music, love, and responders who care about the physical, mental, and spiritual health of our communities. And instead of racial capitalism, misogynist, transphobic, and environmental violence, we want democracy and socialism. I think I've probably used up the 30-minute limit for my talk, and I've not managed to mention, not even once, the current occupant of the White House, who so clearly represents the counterforces in this struggle over the meaning, influence, and structures of racism within an intersectional framework. As many have said, in the upcoming election, in less than 2 months, we here in the US will be called upon to vote against fascism. We know how important this election is for us and the world because the current occupant and his supporters are frantically attempting to suppress the vote. We know that liberation will require a great deal more than voting, but in order to clear the space for more marching, agitating, imaginating, we have to defeat this dangerous man. But defeating him is not sufficient. Neither is a Black woman on the Democratic ticket. Yes, we will have to focus our energies over the next period on the electoral arena, but keeping in mind that our activist and intellectual work will involve efforts to consolidate and deepen this new anti-racist consensus, and above all, to work on more profound popular understandings of racial capitalism. And so I end with Stuart Hall's questions. What are the circumstances in which we now find ourselves? How did they arise? What forces are sustaining them? And what forces are available to us to change them? And finally, these words constitute the conclusion of the 2004 lecture I mentioned earlier. I am afraid, Stuart said, I am afraid the realm of freedom will look mostly like the old realm of servitude, with just a little opening here and there toward the horizon of freedom, justice, and equality. It will not be all that different from the past. Nevertheless, something will have happened. Something will have moved. You will be in a new moment, a new conjuncture, and there will be new relations of forces there to work with. There will be a new conjuncture to understand. There will be work for critical intellectuals to do. I commend that vocation to you if you manage to find it. I commend that vocation to you. I do not claim to have honored that vocation fully in my life, but I say to you, that is kind of what I have been trying to do all this while. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela, for, such a rich and compelling presentation. This idea of, speaking truth to power, engaging with people in struggle, also listening, I guess, not just speaking truth, but listening to truths that emerge from people and the truths that they understand through their everyday experiences, their everyday commitments as they struggle against racism, misogyny, homophobia, and so on. As we've reached the end of our allocated time, or at least our time for now, I'd like to bring the proceedings to a close with some thanks. First, I'd like to thank the Southbank Centre for hosting this event as the first in its Inside Out series. I too am delighted that the Centre has reopened again now in this virtual format. I'd also like to thank the Stuart Hall Foundation for its support in driving forward this agenda of reconstruction, this agenda of thinking through this moment, these times that we're living in, and what exactly it is that we might or can do to build a better world, a more just, a more equitable society. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for your time, for your interest, for your engagement. And I'd also like to thank those of you that took the time to sit down and compose some really thoughtful and really sort of engaged questions for Dr. Davis. Thank you very much for that. And finally, I'd like to thank you, Angela Davis, for your wonderful contribution. Your intervention, I think, has been invaluable. It's been invaluable in various ways, but in stressing the importance of speaking truth to power, the necessity of doing so in a way that is publicly engaged. But at the same time, reminding us of the dangers of sort of falling prey to a reformist agenda, right? And sort of becoming seduced by the notion that we can, with a few tweaks and amendments, improve prisons, for example, make them more sort of humanitarian. I think the dangers of that are important for us to retain sight of. But also this idea that the future is there to be created. The position that young people, as well as the rest of us, but yes, the position that young people hold in that is crucial. It's important. But alongside that, the idea that you've given us that we must think about what it is we oppose, what we dislike, but that we do also have to think about what it is that we want. And you used the word, what do we desire? What do we love? What is it that we wish for or hope for, right? To try and imagine that society that is somehow better, preferable. We haven't experienced it yet, but to think imaginatively and creatively about that. So I'd like to thank you also for your generosity of time, of commitment, of spirit. If we were all in this hall together, I think at this moment there would be a sort of spontaneous erupting of deep appreciation and fulsome and enthusiastic applause. There's no one in this hall, but I feel that that's what would be happening right now. I really do hope that you can sense that. Thank you very much. you.